The boy did not look like someone who belonged on the steps of a courthouse. He was 14 years old, standing on the limestone steps of the Morrow County Courthouse on the last Friday of March, wearing the same canvas work jacket he wore every morning to feed cattle before the sun came up. He was holding a cup of gas station hot chocolate he had not touched. He was the youngest person in the crowd by at least 20 years, and he looked exactly like what he was, a farm kid, slightly underdressed for the occasion, slightly too still for his age. The man in the gray overcoat did not say it meanly. He said it the way people say things they believe to be simply and obviously true, the way you tell someone they have taken the wrong exit or that they are standing in the wrong line. Matter of fact, almost kind about it. "You don't belong here, son." The boy looked at him. He did not look away. He did not shift his weight or adjust his jacket or do any of the things a person does when they feel the need to defend themselves against something. "I know," Eli Carney said, and he stayed exactly where he was. There is a piece of land in the hill country of southeastern Ohio, about 12 miles south of Mount Gilead, that sits in a fold of the landscape the locals have always called the Hollow, not because it is a hollow in the strict geographical sense, but because it sits low between two long ridges in a way that catches the morning fog and holds it close, keeps it thick and low across the pastures until nearly noon on certain days, and makes the farm feel on those mornings especially like it exists slightly apart from the rest of the world, like the rest of the world made a quiet agreement to leave it alone for a while, and the farm accepted the terms without discussion. 80 acres originally, rolling pasture on the upper ground where the soil is thinner and the grass comes in slower but holds through drought better than the low ground. Creek bottom hay ground along the lower fields where the soil runs darker and richer and the grass comes in thick. In a good year, the kind of thick that makes a farmer feel like he might just be doing something right for once, like the land is acknowledging the effort. A red bank barn built in 1961, its boards weathered to the particular shade of red that only comes from decades of painting over previous decades of painting, the color of something that has been maintained rather than replaced. A white farmhouse with a covered porch and a kitchen window that looked out over the near pasture and had been the first thing visible from the lane every single morning for more than 60 years. Harold Karn started with those 80 acres. He bought them in 1959 with money he had saved working a sand and gravel operation outside of Mount Gilead and a loan from a local bank that was then run by a man who shook hands on deals before he signed papers. Harold considered that the proper order of operations. The handshake was the real agreement. The signature on the paper was just the record of it, the thing you pointed to later if someone forgot what they had said when they were standing in front of you. He ran a small cow-calf operation, sold calves in the fall, cut hay in the summer, fixed things when they broke, and did not replace them when fixing was still possible, because Harold Karn did not believe in spending money to solve a problem that patience and a good wrench could handle just as well. He was not a man who spoke much about his philosophy. He expressed it through the condition of his equipment and the tightness of his fences and the quality of the animals that came off his land each fall. The calves Harold Karn sold were consistent, and consistency in a cow-calf operation is the thing that builds a reputation, and a reputation in a small county is the thing that opens doors that money alone cannot. He added to those original 80 acres the way that patient, careful people add to things a little at a time when the opportunity and the finances aligned and not a moment sooner. 20 acres from a neighbor moving to Columbus in 1967, purchased on a handshake and a fair price that neither party had to negotiate very hard because both understood what fair looked like. 30 acres of ridge ground from an estate in 1978, ground that came with some timber value, Harold neither rushed to cut nor neglected to manage, 40 more along the creek bottom in 1989 when the operation had grown enough to need them and Harold had saved long enough to afford them without stretching further than the land itself could support. By the time Harold passed the farm to his son Doyle in 2001, it was 220 acres and it was paid for. Harold was proud of that, proud in the way a man is proud of something he built slowly and honestly over a long span of years, which is a different kind of pride from any other kind. It does not announce itself. It does not need an audience or a certificate or any external confirmation of its validity. It sits inside a man, quiet and permanent, the way good land sits inside a good year, not loud about it, just there, reliable, the thing you come back to when everything else gets uncertain. He passed the farm to Doyle in the late summer of 2001, and the conversation was not long. Harold was not a man who made long speeches about things. He showed Doyle the fence lines he needed to watch in a wet year. He explained which section of the creek bottom tended to flood and how long it stayed wet after a heavy rain. He told him which of the neighboring landowners were good to deal with and which required patience of a specific kind. Then he handed over the deed and said, "Take care of it." And Doyle had said, "I will." And Harold had believed him, because Doyle Carn was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and both of them knew it. Doyle Carn had his father's hands and his father's approach to the earth beneath them. He was not a man who changed things for the sake of changing them. He ran the same breed of cattle his father had run, Black Angus, good genetics, quiet temperament, the kind of animal that rewards a man who pays attention and punishes one who doesn't by making the punishment look like the animal's fault when it is almost never the animal's fault. He cut the same fields his father had cut, in the same order and at roughly the same time of year, because Harold had learned by experience the order and timing that worked best for that particular piece of ground, and Doyle saw no reason to relearn something that had already been learned. He kept the barn painted, he kept the fences tight, and for most of his adult life, this had been enough. Not comfortable, not easy, not the kind of enough that lets a man stop thinking about money altogether, but enough. The particular kind of enough that a man can build a life around and a family and a set of habits that turn into a way of being in the world if he is willing to work for it every single day without exception and without complaint, which Doyle Carn was. Then came the operating loan. In the spring of 5 years before that last Friday of March, Doyle Carn had done the math on modernizing the cattle operation. The corral facilities were aging in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. The squeeze chute Harold had installed in 1974 was functioning technically, but functioning the way old equipment functions when it is past the end of its designed life, unpredictably and with increasing frequency at the worst possible moments. The sorting alley had been patched and repatched until the patches had patches. The loading setup required 2 extra people and twice the time it should have taken, which on a thin margin operation translates directly into money and animal stress, and both of those things matter. His veterinarian had also been advising him gently and then less gently as the years went by to consider a covered feeding setup that would reduce winter hay waste and improve cattle condition through the cold months. A covered setup meant the cattle ate what was put in front of them rather than what the wind left behind after it was done with the rest. The improvements made sense. They made sense on paper, which is where a lot of things make sense that later turn out to be more complicated than paper is able to account for. The loan from First Agricultural Lending of Southeastern Ohio was secured against the farm property, structured over 10 years at terms that were reasonable for the time and the market and manageable, provided 2 things remained stable. The hay yields stayed somewhere near historical average, and Doyle's off-farm income from his night shift at Harmon Industrial in Chillicothe continued. The hay yields did not stay reasonable. 2 summers in a row of dry June and July, The precise months when the first and second hay cuttings need rain most and can least afford to go without it produced yields 60% below the average that the loan's math had been built on. 60% below average in the hay operation means buying hay in the fall at whatever the market is asking, which in a dry year is always more than a man who is already stretched wants to spend. It means selling hay in the spring that should have been kept for winter feeding because the cash is needed now, even though the need for the hay will come later. It means the margins that were thin to begin with compress further and then further still, and eventually they do not just compress. They break, and then Harmon Industrial closed. The plant had been in Chillicothe for 28 years. It had employed 310 people, most of them from the surrounding counties, most of them in the specific situation that Doyle Carn was in running, something else on the side, a farm or a small business or a piece of land they were trying to hold together, using the plant income as the stable foundation the other thing could lean against. When the parent company made the decision to consolidate production at a facility in Tennessee where the costs were lower and the incentives were higher, it gave 60 days notice and then it was done. 60 days and then 310 families in the county sat down at their kitchen tables and began recalculating everything. Doyle Carn was one of them. He picked up part-time work where he could find it, a delivery route that paid less than the plant and required more driving, fence work for neighbors, which he was good at, but which paid by the hour and required hours he did not always have, selling a few more calves each fall than he had intended, which meant a few fewer replacement heifers, the following spring which meant a slightly smaller breeding herd, the year after that which meant a slightly smaller calf crop, the year after that, the kind of slow arithmetic of reduction that is almost invisible year to year, but becomes undeniable when you look back across 5 years of it. He made the loan payments for 2 years after the plant closed, drawing down the farm's thin operating reserve to do it because Doyle Carn did not default on obligations. Then the reserve was gone, and the payments were missed, and the letters from First Agricultural Lending began arriving with a particular formality, the formality of letters that have been reviewed by a legal department before being sent, that use language carefully in the way that language is used carefully when it is going to be referred to later in proceedings of a specific and consequential kind. He had talked to them, made arrangements, restructured the loan once in the second year of missed payments at terms that were harder than the original terms, but that represented the outer edge of what First Agricultural Lending was willing to do. He had met those terms for 14 months, and then the restructured arrangement had also failed, and the home parcel, the original 80 acres, the core of what Harold had assembled, the land with the house and the barn and the near pastures and the feed bunk Harold had built in 1963, and the kitchen window that had looked out over all of it for 60 years had been scheduled for foreclosure auction. Last Friday of March, 10 in the morning, Morrow County Courthouse steps. What Doyle Carne did not do for longer than he should have was tell his family what was coming. He told himself he was protecting them. Doyle had grown up in a house where the men carried weight without displaying it, where financial difficulty was not discussed at the dinner table, where a bad year might show on a man's face in the tightness around his jaw or the set of his shoulders, but not in his words, not at home, not in front of the people who depended on him to be steady. Harold had never brought the stress of the farm's difficulties into the house any further than his own expression, and he had never explained this as a philosophy or a decision. He had simply done it, and Doyle had absorbed it as the correct way to be, the way men absorbed things from their fathers, before anyone thought to question whether the thing being absorbed was actually correct. You carried it yourself. You did not put adult burdens on a child's shoulders. You did not add your weight to someone else's load. What Doyle did not account for in all of this was Eli. Eli Karn had been paying attention since he was old enough to understand what attention was for. He had noticed the envelopes first, not their contents. Doyle was careful to keep those out of reach, to bring them in from the mailbox and move directly to his office, which was really just a corner of the equipment shed with a desk and a filing cabinet and a lamp. But the return address on them, the frequency with which they appeared, and the way his father's jaw set when he came in from the mailbox on certain afternoons. Not all afternoons, certain ones. The particular ones when the envelope was from First Agricultural Lending of southeastern Ohio. Eli had read the return address once from across the room when he was 9 years old, and he had not needed to read it again. He had memorized it the way you memorize things that matter automatically and completely. He had noticed the extra calves sold in the fall of the second bad hay year. Not dramatically more, not enough to make a point of just a few more than the year before, and a few less staying behind in the pasture. He had noticed the way his father looked at the pasture after the truck with the extra calves had gone down the lane. It was not a dramatic look. It was a quiet look, the look of a man who has done what needed to be done and does not particularly want to discuss it or have it noticed, but cannot entirely control the expression on his face when he thinks no one is watching. Eli was always watching. He had noticed his mother's careful quiet at the kitchen table over the winter evenings, the way Laurel Karn moved numbers around on a notepad with a pen, her handwriting small and precise, the columns of figures going down the page in the particular order of a woman who has taught herself to manage money carefully, because careful management is the only tool available. The pen going still when she heard someone coming, starting again when she was sure she was alone. Eli had not asked, not directly, not because he was afraid to ask or because he did not want to know, but because he understood in the wordless way that children sometimes understand things before adults have taught them to doubt their instincts, that asking would put something into the air that could not be taken back, that certain things are held in place precisely by not being named, that once you say a thing out loud in a family, the family has to respond to it, and sometimes the family is not ready for that yet, and making them respond before they are ready does not help anyone. So, instead of asking, he had started working. Eli Karn was 9 years old when he began, not because his parents had asked him to, not as a chore or an assignment with defined parameters and an expected outcome and a specific completion date. He had started because he had looked at the farm, the specific physical thing that his grandfather Harold had built from nothing over 40 years, and that his father Doyle was trying to hold together against circumstances that were no longer cooperating, and he had understood with a clarity that had no words attached to it and needed none, that the farm was in trouble and that he was not too young to do something about it. He did not have a plan, he had a direction. He started with Mrs. Hester Boone, who lived a mile up the road and was 71 years old and had a large vegetable garden that she had tended for 40 years and could no longer fully manage on her own. Her knees had made their position clear the previous summer, and the garden had showed it. Eli showed up at her door on a Saturday morning in early May and asked if she needed help. She had looked at him over the top of her glasses for a moment with the expression of a woman assessing whether an offer is genuine or polite, and then she said yes and told him what needed doing and paid him $5 an hour without being asked what his rate was. He saved every dollar of it. He opened a savings account at the bank in Mount Gilead the following week, the kind designed for children, with a small paper passbook and no fees, and a teller who smiled at him when he came in and who did not make him feel small for the size of the deposits he was making. He made a deposit every time he earned anything. He watched the number in the passbook grow, which was slow, and he kept watching anyway, because watching it was the only form of doing something that was available to him at 9 years old, and doing something, any form of doing something, was better than waiting and hoping and watching his father's jaw set at the mailbox. At 10 years old, he built a roadside stand. He found a piece of scrap plywood in the equipment shed that was the right size and not being used for anything. He found a can of barn paint on the shelf beside the window, the same red that had been on the barn for as long as he could remember, and he painted letters on the plywood with a brush he cleaned afterward and returned to its hook. The letters were not entirely even. The spacing between words was not quite consistent, but they were legible, and they said what they needed to say without anything extra. Eli's Stand Fresh Produce, Honest Prices. He set it at the end of the lane on summer mornings before the heat got fully into the day and staffed it himself, sitting on an overturned crate with a cash box from the equipment shed and whatever the season was offering that week. Tomatoes from the surplus of Mrs. Boone's garden, which produced more than she could use even in the years her knees would have let her keep up with it. Sweet corn from a plot behind the barn that his mother had given him permission to use. The plot Harold had originally kept for a kitchen garden and that had sat partially unused for several years. Green beans and cucumbers and whatever else he could grow or source that someone might stop for on their way through on a summer morning. The Porters stopped every week without fail. Jim and Carol Porter, whose daughter had been in Eli's class since kindergarten, who lived 4 miles up the road and drove past the stand on their way to town every Saturday morning. They bought more than they needed most weeks and never asked for a discount on anything, and Eli understood this as a form of kindness, extended in a way that preserved everyone's dignity, which is the best kind of kindness because it does not require the recipient to feel grateful in a way that is uncomfortable. He was grateful anyway. He just did not say so because the Porters were clearly trying to make it easy to not have to say so, and honoring that seemed like the right thing to do. At 11 years old on a Saturday morning in early April, when the ground was still soft from the last of the winter wet, Eli Carney walked up the lane to the Greer farm without being invited and without calling ahead. The Greer farm sat on 300 acres to the north of the Carney property, the land running up over the ridge and back down the other side in the long, slightly irregular shape of a piece of ground that had been assembled from several smaller parcels over several decades. Birch Greer was 68 years old, at the time a widower of 5 years, who had farmed his land alone since his wife Marin passed, whose son Garrett had moved to Columbus for work in the construction industry, and who came back for holidays and occasionally for a weekend in the fall if the deer season aligned. The farm showed the specific quality of a one-man enterprise being run past the point where one man can reasonably manage all of it alone. Not neglected. Birch Greer was not a man who neglected things, but thinned. The fences were maintained, but not tight everywhere. The equipment yard was organized, but not as organized as it had been. The sorting corrals needed work that had been deferred because there was always something more immediately urgent than the corrals. Eli came up the lane and knocked on the equipment shed door, which was the door you knocked on if you were coming to see a farmer about work, as distinct from the house door, which was the door you knocked on if you were coming to see a person about something personal. This distinction was something Eli understood without having been explicitly taught it. Birch Greer came out of the shed, looked at the boy standing in his yard in a canvas jacket, 2 sizes too large for him, and said nothing for a long moment, the kind of moment that is not uncomfortable, because the man doing the looking is not using it to make anyone uncomfortable, but simply to see what is in front of him clearly before he says anything about it. "You know how to stretch wire," Birch said. "My dad taught me," Eli said. Birch looked at him for another moment. Then he turned back toward the equipment shed door and said, "Come on then." And that was the beginning of it. What Eli did not know at the time and would not fully understand until much later was that Birch Greer had not been surprised to see him. Birch had been watching the Carney farm from the ridge for longer than Eli had been watching the envelopes at the mailbox. He knew the Carney land. He knew the look of it in a good year and the look of it in a bad one. And he had watched the 2 bad hay years and understood what they meant for a family carrying the kind of debt that a modernization loan represents when the income streams that were supposed to service it stopped cooperating. He had known that Doyle Carn lost his night shift at Harmon when the plant closed because in a county of that size, that kind of information moves through the community the way water moves through limestone, quietly through every available path, until it has reached everywhere it is going to reach. He had not offered to help Doyle because Doyle Carn was not the kind of man who accepted help easily, and Birch Greer was not the kind of man who offered it in ways that required the other person to say yes or no to something they had not asked for. The dignity of the person on the receiving end mattered to Birch. He had been on the receiving end of help offered in ways that did not account for that dignity, and he remembered how it felt, and he did not do that to people. But a boy showing up in his yard on a Saturday morning asking to work, that was different. That was not charity. That was a transaction, and transactions were something both parties could enter with their dignity intact. Birch paid Eli $8 an hour, which was more than Eli had asked for, because Eli had not known what to ask for and had not asked for any specific amount. He simply said he would work hard and do what he was told to do, and Birch had named the rate without negotiation or explanation. Every other Saturday through that fall, and then through the following spring, and then through the following summer, Eli appeared at the Greer farm in the early morning, worked until noon, ate whatever Birch put in front of him at the kitchen table for lunch, usually something simple, eggs or soup or a sandwich with good bread without complaint and without comment on what it was, and then walked home. He did not tell his father how much he was earning. He kept it in the passbook, and he watched the number grow, and he said nothing. What he did do was pay attention to everything Birch showed him. Birch Greer was not a man who explained things using more words than they required. He showed you how to do a thing. He watched you do it. He told you what you had gotten wrong specifically and without softening it unnecessarily, because unnecessary softening was a form of imprecision, and imprecision in fence work was the thing that cost you cattle and time. He told you what you had gotten right, also specifically, because knowing what you did right was as important as knowing what you did wrong, and most people only ever heard about the wrong. Under Birch's instruction across those Saturday mornings, stretched over 3 years, Eli learned how to set a corner post deep enough and plumb enough to anchor a fence line through a decade of freeze and thaw cycles without moving. He learned how to read the tension in a wire by running his hand along it, feeling for the specific vibration that meant it was right, that it would hold what it was meant to hold. He learned how to look at a piece of land and understand what it was telling you about what it needed, rather than deciding what you wanted to give it and giving it that regardless of what the land actually required. He learned things that could not be written in a manual because they required a body and time and a particular quality of attention to learn, the kind of learning that only happens through repetition, across seasons, through being in a specific place, in a specific kind of weather, and understanding what the weather is doing to the ground and the grass and the animals and the structures and what those things need from you in response. Birch taught him all of this, not as explicit lessons, as the natural byproduct of working alongside someone who knew what he was doing and was not careless about it. At 12 years old, Eli started hauling hay. 2 neighboring farms baled their hay and needed help with the loading and stacking. Eli recruited a school friend named Trevor Holt, who was willing to work and needed the money for his own reasons, which Eli did not ask about because they were Trevor's reasons and not his business. Together, they spent 3 weekends each July in the upper lofts of hay barns stacking bales in the particular dry, dense heat that only exists in the upper story of a working barn in high summer, the kind of heat that has weight and texture that makes the air feel like something you have to push through rather than something you breathe that makes the skin of your forearms itch from the hay dust and the chaff that makes you understand with your whole body and not just your mind why this work was considered among the harder jobs on a farm before mechanization offered alternatives. Eli deposited his share every time they finished a weekend, walking into the bank in Mount Gilead on Monday mornings, still smelling slightly of hay, handing the cash across the counter, watching the teller write the new balance in the passbook. He did not tell his parents what the account held. He did not tell them because he understood in the quiet and certain way that he understood most things that mattered, that what was accumulating in that account was not spending money and not emergency money in the ordinary sense of emergency. It was something without a good name, something more like a conviction that had taken the shape of a number. He had only the sense running beneath everything, like groundwater beneath a field, invisible from the surface, and yet the thing the field depended on entirely, that the farm was in trouble, serious enough to require more than patience, that the account might one day be the difference between his family's life going one way or another way, and that the most important thing he could do was make sure the money was there when the moment it was needed arrived. He did not know if it would be enough. He did not know what enough looked like. He kept saving anyway because saving was the only action available to him, and action was what he had decided to be when he was 9 years old in the place of worry. He was right that the money mattered. He would not know until much later how close the edge actually was and how much closer it was than anyone had told him. Laurel Carn found out about the account in January of the year the auction was scheduled, and she found out because Eli told her. He had come home from school on a Thursday afternoon in the gray middle of that January and found her at the kitchen table with the most recent letter from First Agricultural Lending open and flat on the table in front of her. She had not heard him come in through the back door, which he had opened and closed more quietly than usual without quite deciding to the way you move quietly when you sense something in a house before you have seen it. He had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his mother, reading something that was making her hold herself very still, the particular stillness of a person who is using all available energy to keep something inside, to maintain the surface of composure, while something beneath it pushes against that surface from the wrong direction. He had stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he had made a decision in the way that he made most decisions, without a great deal of deliberation, without consulting a list of options, with the same directness that had sent him up the lane to Birch Greer's farm on a Saturday morning 3 years earlier. He walked to the table and sat down across from his mother. He did not ask what the letter said. He did not ask how bad it was, or whether there was a plan, or any of the questions that would have required her to speak before she was ready. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, where he had started keeping the passbook a few weeks earlier, without exactly deciding, to the way you keep something close when you understand it might be needed suddenly, and he placed it on the table between them, face up, open to the most recent balance page. Laurel looked at the passbook. She looked at the number. She looked at her son. "How long?" she said. It was not quite a question. It came out of her with the flatness of someone who is being careful with their voice, each word placed deliberately, because the voice cannot be entirely trusted right now. "Since I was 9, Eli said. Laurel pressed both hands flat on the table, in front of her fingers, spread the way you press your hands on something solid when you need something solid beneath you. She looked at her hands, then she looked at her son again, and the expression on her face was the kind that has no clean name because it lives in the place where gratitude and grief and pride run together and become something that does not separate back out again into its component parts cleanly or possibly at all. "Did you know about the loan?" she asked. "Not exactly," Eli said. "I knew something was wrong. The balance in the passbook was $9,400. 5 years of Saturday mornings at Mrs. Boone's garden, 5 years of summer mornings at the produce stand At the end of the lane, the sign with the uneven letters and the honest prices. 5 years of every other Saturday on Birch Greer's fence lines in all weathers. 3 summers of July barn lofts. Every dollar deposited, every balance recorded in the small, careful handwriting of a boy who understood that the number in the passbook was not just a number, it was time. It was early mornings and sore arms and lunches eaten at a widower's kitchen table. It was the specific and unrepeatable shape of 5 years of a life. $9,400. It was at that moment everything Eli Carne had. Laurel sat with it for a long time. She did not cry because Laurel Carne was not a woman who cried easily or in front of people, even her own son, even at the kitchen table in the middle of January when the thing in front of her was almost too large to hold. She sat with it the way you sit with something true that is also too big to fully comprehend all at once, giving it the time it needed to settle into its proper shape inside her. Then she looked at her son across the kitchen table in the farmhouse Harold Carne had built on land. Harold Carne had bought with a handshake and patience and 40 years of incremental intention, and she said, "I want to try." Eli said, "So do I." Outside the kitchen window, the near pasture was brown with late winter, the grass flattened and gray gold under the pale January light. The bare tree line ran along the far ridge. The fog had lifted that morning the way it always did, burning off by mid-morning and leaving the field visible all the way to the creek at the south end, and the field looked exactly like what it was, ground that had been worked and tended and cared for by the same family for more than 60 years, that carried the specific weight of that history in the way that land carries such things, not visibly, but really in its composition and its condition and the particular quality of the light that came off it in the late afternoon. It looked like something worth everything they had. The boy, who had been paying attention since he was 9 years old, sat across from his mother at the kitchen table, and they looked at the number in the passbook together, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the near pasture was visible through the window behind them, and the farm was still there. That part at least was still true. The part that was coming was 6 weeks away. Laurel Carne was up before 5 the next morning. She did not wake Doyle. She moved through the dark house with the practiced quiet of a woman who has spent years navigating the hours before sunrise without disturbing anyone, down the stairs and into the kitchen, where she turned on only the light above the stove, the small one, the one that gave enough light to see by, without filling the room with the kind of brightness that announces the day has started, whether you are ready for it or not. She sat at the table with the passbook and a notepad and a pen, and she did what she had been doing in her head for weeks. She ran the numbers, this time with $9,400 in the column, where before there had been nothing, and the column changed, the total change. She wrote it down and looked at it, and the looking at it with the actual number on actual paper, rather than in her head, where numbers have a tendency to become either better or worse than they actually are, told her 2 things clearly. The first thing was that $9,400 added to what she and Doyle had in their joint operating account after the winter bills gave her something real to work with, not enough on its own, but a foundation, a place to build from. The second thing was that a foreclosure auction on 80 acres of hill country farmland with a house and a barn and creek frontage was not going to open at $15,000 and stay there. Someone was going to be in that crowd with a leather portfolio and a ceiling she could not see the top of, and the number was going to move, and she needed to be ready for it to move further than the foundation she currently had. She sat with both of those things for the length of time it took the coffee to brew. Then she picked up the pen and wrote 3 names on the notepad. She was not a woman who asked for things easily. Laurel Carne had grown up in the hill country with the particular disposition towards self-sufficiency that the hill country produces In people part practical, part pride, part the accumulated cultural understanding of a community where nearly everyone is close to some edge or another, and adding your weight to someone else's burden is not something you do without very good reason. You handled your own. You found a way. The idea of calling people up and telling them your troubles and asking for their help was not something that came naturally or comfortably or without cost. But she had a son who had saved $9,400 since he was 9 years old by getting up early and doing work no one asked him to do and not telling anyone about it. If Eli could do that, she could make some phone calls. She started with the Sullivans. Ray and Dina Sullivan had known Doyle since they were all in the same county schools, together had farmed their land on the other side of the ridge for 30 years, had sat at the Carney kitchen table more times than anyone had counted, and never needed a reason beyond the fact that they were neighbors, and neighbors in the hill country meant something specific and durable. Ray Sullivan picked up on the second ring, which told Laurel he had already been awake, which told her something about the kind of man he was at this hour in the morning, which she already knew. She told him what she needed to tell him without more detail than was necessary, and without softening the parts that were hard, because softening them would have required Ray to pretend he had not heard what she was actually saying. Ray Sullivan was not a man who appreciated being required to pretend. He listened without interrupting. "How much are you short?" he said when she was done. "I don't know exactly," Laurel said. "The opening bid is $15,000, but there will be other bidders." "There always are," Ray said. "Give me a day." The Sullivans contributed $1,200. Ray drove it over in cash 2 days later and set it on the kitchen counter without ceremony and without staying for coffee, because staying for coffee would have made it a gift that required gratitude, and Ray Sullivan was making a contribution to something that he considered a matter of the community's own interest, which did not require gratitude in the way that gifts do. He said, "Good luck on Friday," and went back to his truck and drove home. She called the Porters next. Jim and Carol Porter, whose daughter had sat next to Eli in class since kindergarten, who had stopped at the produce stand at the end of the lane every summer Saturday for 4 years running, buying more than they needed and never once asking for a reduction in price, even when the prices were the prices of a 10-year-old who had not entirely figured out the economics of a roadside stand. Carol Porter answered the phone and listened without much comment while Laurel explained the situation, and when Laurel finished, Carol said, "We've been buying vegetables from that boy since he was 10 years old." A pause. "Of course we will." The Porters contributed $1,100. The third call was the hardest because it required Laurel to reach outside the circle of people she would ordinarily have called the people who knew the Carney farm and had reason to care about it, and to whom the situation would have made immediate and personal sense. The third call was to Ruth Calloway. Ruth Calloway was a retired schoolteacher who lived in a small house on the edge of Mount Gilead and had no connection to farming or farmland or the particular arithmetic of a foreclosure auction. She had met Laurel at a church potluck 3 years earlier, and at the end of that evening, as coats were being collected and goodbyes were being said, Ruth had done what people sometimes do. At the end of pleasant evenings, she had said something generous without necessarily having been tested on whether she meant it. "If you ever need anything, I mean it, anything at all, you call me." Most people who say that mean it as warmth as the generous feeling of a good evening, and would respond adequately if called upon, but in a scaled-down way, a casserole or a ride to an appointment, not in the way that the words themselves, taken seriously, actually implied. Laurel had filed the offer away because she filed most things away without throwing them out on the principle that you do not always know in advance what you are going to need. She called Ruth Calloway on a Tuesday morning. Ruth listened to everything, not just the loan and the auction date and the 6 weeks remaining. She listened to all of it, the passbook, and the 9 years old, and the 5 years of Saturday mornings, and the produce stand with the sign that wasn't quite straight, and the way Eli had sat down across from Laurel at the kitchen table in January and placed the passbook between them without saying anything more than was necessary to explain it. Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Laurel was done, Ruth was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be real. Then she said, "How much do you need from me?" Ruth Calloway, who had no connection to farming and had never met Eli Karn, contributed $1,500. She brought it to Laurel in a sealed envelope with nothing written on the outside, and when Laurel tried to say something adequate about it, Ruth shook her head and said, "I said I meant it. Now I know whether I did." And she went back to her car and drove home. $1,200 from the Sullivans, $1,100 from the Porters, $1,500 from Ruth Calloway, combined with the $9,400 in the passbook, that was $13,200 in cash contributions. Laurel looked at the number on the notepad. Then she looked at the joint account balance she had written below it. She added $3,000 from the joint account, money she had not told Doyle she was going to use because Doyle would have told her it was the last operational buffer they had, which was true, and that they could not spend it, which she understood and was doing anyway, because the last buffer is still something, and something is still better than the alternative of arriving at a foreclosure auction with less than everything you have. $16,200 total. She counted it twice, the physical bills and the figures on the notepad, to make sure she had not made an error. She had not. She did the arithmetic one more time slower to be certain. It came to the same number. She sat with the number for a long time. On paper, $16,200 looked like more than enough. The opening bid was $15,000. She had more than $15,000. On paper, that was a surplus. But Laurel Karn had lived in the hill country long enough to understand something about foreclosure auctions on good farmland. They did not stay at the opening bid. They never stayed at the opening bid, not when the land had a house on it and a barn on it and creek frontage and a location within reasonable distance of a county seat. Someone would be there. Someone was always there for whom that land was not a home and a history and 60 years of a family's work, but a number on a spreadsheet, and that someone would have done their arithmetic the same way Laurel had done hers, and their ceiling would be higher than hers, and the number would move. She knew this. She sealed the envelope anyway. She sealed it with everything in it. The $16,200, that was all they had, and she put it in the inside pocket of her good coat, and she did not take it out again until Friday morning. She sealed it the way she had always approached the things in her life that she was not ready for, but had to face, regardless, with both hands on it, with her full attention present, with the understanding that arriving at something you are not ready for is not defeat. It is the beginning of every worthwhile thing. The preparation is not a guarantee. The showing up is not a guarantee. But not showing up is the one thing that guarantees nothing. She put the coat with the envelope in it on the hook by the back door, and she watched the week move toward Friday. What Laurel did not tell Eli was that she had known for several days that the envelope was not enough. She had not arrived at this knowledge suddenly. She had arrived at it through the same slow, careful arithmetic she applied to everything, running the numbers, considering the variables, accounting for the presence of Douglas Fenn, or someone very much like Douglas Fenn, and arriving at the conclusion that $16,200 was not a ceiling that would hold against serious competition for a piece of ground this desirable. She had known it for most of the week before the auction. She had not told Eli. She had not told him because he was carrying enough. He had been carrying since he was 9 years old, and she was not going to place the specific weight of an $800 shortfall on top of what he was already holding. Some burdens you carry for the people you love precisely because they cannot afford to carry them, and also carry everything else they are carrying. This was one of those burdens. She sealed the envelope, knowing the shortfall, and she carried it alone, because that was what mothers did, and because Eli had already done enough. 3 days before the auction, Doyle found the envelope. He had been out in the cold until past 8 in the evening, checking the fence line on the back ridge where a section of wire had been giving him trouble all winter, loosening in the freeze-thaw cycle in a way that wanted proper retensioning when the ground softened enough to reset the posts. He came in through the back door and pulled off his boots and his work coat and went to the kitchen for water, and the envelope was on the counter where Laurel had set it down while she went upstairs for something. Doyle picked it up because it was there, and the weight of it was unusual heavier than a single piece of paper, heavier than anything that ordinarily sat on that counter with a particular heft that told his hands, before his mind had fully registered it, that this was something that mattered. He opened it. He counted the money slowly. Once and then again, he stood at the kitchen counter in his work clothes with the money in his hands, and he read the numbers on the notepad tucked inside the breakdown of where each amount had come from in Laurel's small, careful handwriting. The Sullivans, the Porters, Ruth Calloway, the joint account, and the $9,400 that was labeled in his wife's handwriting simply Eli. He set everything back on the counter. He sat down on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet and his legs stretched out in front of him on the linoleum and his hands resting open on his thighs, and he did not get up for a long time. He did not turn on any lights. He sat in the kitchen in the dark with the number $16,200 in his head and the knowledge of where it had come from and what it represented, and he let himself be with what he now understood had been happening in his own house around him in the years while he had been carrying the weight of the loan and the silence and the particular shame of a man who inherited something his father built and could not protect it from coming apart. $9,400. His son had been 9 years old when he started. Doyle had seen the Saturday mornings. That was the thing that sat the heaviest in the dark kitchen. He had seen Eli leave the house in the early gray light and walk up the lane toward the Greer farm, and he had known where the boy was going, because you know where your child is going in a county of this size, and he had known Birch Greer was paying him for the work, because Birch Greer was not a man who accepted work without paying for it. What Doyle had not known, had not allowed himself to ask about, because asking would have required him to acknowledge out loud what asking implied was that Eli had been saving it, all of it, for the farm, for this, since he was 9 years old. He had not asked because asking would have meant saying to his son directly that the son had understood something the father was trying to keep hidden, that the boy had seen what the man was trying to make invisible. That conversation was one Doyle had not known how to begin, and so he had not begun it. And the weeks had become months, and the months had become years, and now he was sitting on his kitchen floor in the dark with the evidence of 5 years of his 14-year-old son's work spread out on the counter above him. He sat there until he heard Eli's boots on the back steps. He stood. He put the money back in the envelope. He placed it exactly where he had found it. He moved to the sink and stood with his back to the door and his hands around his water glass and his eyes on the dark yard outside the window, giving himself the few seconds he needed to put his face into the expression that was not quite composed, but was as close to composed as he could get right now. Eli came through the door. He stopped. He looked at his father's back. He looked at the envelope on the counter. He looked at his father again. Doyle did not turn around immediately. When he did, his face was the face of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not sure he would be able to reach. Not peace and not resolution, but the particular stillness that comes when a decision has been made that cannot be unmade, and you have accepted it, and you are no longer fighting what is true. I saw what was in the envelope, Doyle said. Eli did not say anything. Doyle looked at his son. He looked at him the way you look at someone when you are trying to hold what you feel about them, and also hold yourself together at the same time, and the two things require different muscles, and they do not work well simultaneously. I'm not going to tell you to stay home tomorrow, Doyle said. He said it, and he meant it completely, and he nodded once, the small single nod of a man who has said what he meant to say and trusts that it has been heard, and then he picked up his water glass and went upstairs. Eli stood in the empty kitchen for a moment, alone with the envelope on the counter and the lingering evidence of his father's presence in the room. He looked at the envelope. He picked it up and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket in the same place he had been keeping the passbook, and he went upstairs to his room, and he lay down on his bed with his boots still on, and he stared at the ceiling, and he did not sleep. At 10 o'clock he got up and went outside. The cold was sharp and clean, the kind of late March cold that comes from a clear sky and no wind, the stars bright and close in the way they only are when the air between you and them has nothing in it. He went to the barn without turning on any lights, moving through the dark yard with the ease of someone who has moved through it so many times that his feet knew the path without instruction from the rest of him. He went through the barn door and into the warmth and smell of it, hay and cattle, and the particular deep animal warmth of a working barn in winter, the warmth that comes from living things and has a different quality than the warmth that comes from a furnace or a fire. The cattle shifted when they heard him, a few turning toward the sound, their breath visible in the cold air near the open door. He moved down the feed aisle to the bunk Harold had built in the winter of 1963, the heavy wooden bunk that Doyle had repaired twice and repainted once, and that sat exactly where Harold had placed it in the exact spot where the morning light came through the east window and landed in the early hours. Eli sat down on the edge of the bunk and put his hand on the wood. It was cold and heavy and solid in the way that things are solid when they were built by someone who intended them to outlast themselves, and they have. He sat there and he counted, because counting was what he did when he needed his mind to have something to do that was not feeling. He counted the cattle in the near pen 14, the same 14 it had been since October. He counted the bales in the lower mow, visible through the gap in the floor, 11 enough for another 3 weeks if the weather stayed where it was. He counted the fence posts he could see through the east window along the near pasture in the moonlight, 22, all standing straight, all the wire running tight between them, the way Birch had taught him to leave it. He did not pray, he did not cry, he did not let his mind go to the version of tomorrow that went the wrong way, because that version was not useful, and he had not spent 5 years making himself useful by going to places that were not useful. He counted. He sat with his hand on Harold's feed bunk in the dark, warm barn. He waited for the morning. He went back inside at 11 and lay down and closed his eyes, and the alarm went off at 5:30, and he got up and fed the cattle the way he did every morning, methodically and without wasted motion, the same routine, in the same order, the bucket to the bunk and back, the water check, the quick assessment of each animal. The cattle pressed toward the feed bunk the way they always did, indifferent to what the day held for the humans responsible for them, interested only in what was immediately in front of them, which Eli found steadying rather than frustrating this particular morning. He latched the barn door at 6:45. He went to the house and changed into the cleanest clothes he owned. He came downstairs and found Laurel in the kitchen with her coat on and the envelope in her hand and her car keys on the counter, and they went out to the car and drove the 12 miles to Mount Gilead in the early light of the last Friday of March. The roads were empty, and the fields on either side were bare and brown, and the ridges ran their familiar lines against a sky that had not yet decided what it intended, the light coming up in the east with the reluctant quality of a late winter morning. Laurel drove. Eli sat in the passenger seat with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the land go by, the farms he knew by name, the fields he could read by condition, the fence lines he could evaluate at 50 miles an hour by the way they ran. He had been looking at this landscape his whole life. He looked at it now with the specific attention of someone who understands that looking at something carefully might be a form of holding on to it, even if holding on is not finally up to you. The courthouse parking lot was half full when they arrived. They walked across the cold asphalt to the limestone steps, and the crowd that had gathered there had the particular quality of crowds that gather at county foreclosure auctions, specific and knowing, composed of people who understood exactly what was happening and had their own reasons for being present. A pair of men in matching Carhartt jackets with the look of farm managers working on someone else's behalf, sent to represent interests that had no intention of showing up personally. A young couple who had done their research and brought a folder and looked slightly nervous in the way of people who are prepared but are not sure preparation will be enough. Several older men who attended every county auction as a matter of habit and information and the occasional opportunity. And Douglas Fenn, standing near the front of the steps with a leather portfolio under his arm and a gray overcoat over a suit that had not come from anywhere in this county. His posture was the posture of a man who had attended many proceedings like this one and found them to be in aggregate reliable, the posture of someone for whom the outcome of auctions like this had always in his experience been available to him if he wanted it badly enough, which was determined by the arithmetic rather than the sentiment. He looked at Eli the way a person looks at something that does not fit the established pattern. "You don't belong here, son," he said, not meanly, as a matter of observable fact. "I know," Eli said, and stayed exactly where he was. Carl Briggs called the auction to order at 2 minutes past 10 with the brisk, clean efficiency of a man who understood that the kindest thing he could do for everyone present was to move through it without unnecessary ceremony. He described the property. He read the legal description. He set the opening bid, $15,000. Douglas Fenn said $15,000 without looking up. Briggs asked for $15,500. Laurel Karn raised her hand. The sound that moved through the crowd was not loud. It was the sound of 30 people making a collective adjustment, a slight reorientation, the particular quality of attention that shifts when something unexpected has entered a situation that seems settled. Fenn said 16,000 without pausing. Laurel said 16,500. Fenn said 17,000. Laurel said 17,200. She said it quietly and clearly, and with the steadiness of a woman who has made her decision and is at the far edge of what the decision allows. And when she said it, Eli knew because he had memorized the number in the envelope, the way he memorized fence post counts and hay bale tallies, that she had said everything they had. $17,200, all of it, every Saturday on Birch Greer's fence lines, every July in the barn loft heat, every summer morning at the produce stand, every dollar the Sullivans and the Porters and Ruth Calloway had contributed to an envelope for a boy most of them had never had a conversation with. All of it in one number, in one raised hand in Laurel Karn's steady voice. Briggs looked for 17,400. Fenn, not looking at Laurel, not looking at Eli, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing arithmetic, said 17,400. The crowd went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. This was the quiet of an outcome becoming visible, of a shape forming in the cold air above the limestone steps. Laurel's hand tightened on the envelope inside her coat. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were straight ahead. Eli looked down at the limestone beneath his feet. He began to count the blocks. 1, 2, 3. The way Harold had counted fence posts in hard moments, a habit Eli had absorbed from stories about his grandfather without being directly taught it. The counting was not about the numbers. It was about having something for the mind to do while the rest of you held on. 4, 5, 6. He did not look up. And then from the back of the crowd, in a voice not loud, exactly as loud as it needed to be, and not 1 degree more, A voice said, 17.5. Eli looked up. At the very back of the courthouse steps, standing slightly apart from the crowd, in the way that a man stands when he has positioned himself where he can see everything without being the thing that people are looking at, was Birch Greer. Felt hat, work coat, hands in his pockets. He looked like a man who had stopped on his way somewhere else and found something worth pausing for. He looked like a man who had been there for a while without anyone noticing, which was, for anyone who knew Birch Greer, exactly what he was and exactly what he had intended. Douglas Fenn turned and looked at him. The look lasted only a moment, but it was the look of a man recalibrating. A new variable had entered a calculation that had been until 17.5 proceeding along expected lines. Fenn adjusted the portfolio under his arm. He turned back to Carl Briggs. He said $18,000. Birch said 18.5. No pause, no adjustment in volume or tempo. The number came out of Birch Greer with the same weight and the same pace as 17.5 had, which was the weight and pace of a man who has already decided how far he is going and is not performing the decision, just executing it. Fenn said 19,000. Birch said 19.5. The 30 people on the limestone steps had stopped shuffling and adjusting. They were standing still, the specific stillness of an audience that has recognized something worth watching and does not want to miss any of it. The men in the Carhartt jackets had their phones lowered. The young couple with the folder had stopped looking at each other and were looking at the back of the crowd. The older men who attended every county auction had the expressions of people who had seen this kind of thing before, but not often, and who knew enough to know that not often meant it was worth remembering. Fenn went to 20,000. Birch said 21. Fenn turned then, a full turn. He looked at the man at the back of the steps, the felt hat and the work coat and the hands still in the pockets, the pale blue eyes steady under the brim, and he did the specific calculation that men in his position do when they encounter something they did not plan for. He ran the arithmetic of comparable land sales in Morrow County, the cost and timeline of subdivision approval, the carrying costs against the projected return at this purchase price, the margin at 21,000 versus the margin at 19 versus the margin at 17, the point at which the land stopped making sense as a number and became only a number paid for a piece of ground that would not give it back at a profit within any reasonable horizon. He had reached that point. Douglas Fenn closed his leather portfolio. The motion was small, a simple mechanical action, a man closing a notebook. But in the specific context of what had been happening on those limestone steps for the past 10 minutes, it was as legible as a sentence spoken aloud. Everyone present understood what it meant in the way that crowds at auctions develop a collective fluency for the language of these moments. The young couple exhaled simultaneously. One of the Carhartt jacket men shifted his weight. The older men exchanged looks that said quietly and without words that this was the part worth remembering. Fenn said nothing further. Carl Briggs looked around the assembled crowd for 21-2. The cold March air sat over all of them. The bare trees along the courthouse square did not move. The sky had the high, flat quality of a late winter sky that is holding something back. No one moved. Briggs brought down the gavel. Sold to the gentleman at the back. $21,000. The sound was small, a wooden sound in a cold morning in a county seat of a certain size at a proceeding that would not be written about in any publication or remembered by anyone beyond the people on those steps and the families they would go home to. A small sound that marked a before and an after in the same way that all the most important sounds do not with volume but with finality. Eli heard it with his whole body. He had been counting limestone blocks. He stopped at 6. He raised his head. He looked at Carl Briggs and at the gavel and at Douglas Fenn, who was already turning from the steps with the closed portfolio under his arm and the forward-facing expression of a man moving to the next item on a list that continues past this one without particular regret. Then he looked at the back of the crowd. Birch Greer had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been standing, with his hands in his pockets and the felt hat against the cold, and he was looking at Eli with an expression that said nothing, that required words, and everything that mattered. The expression of a man who has done a thing and is not looking for acknowledgement of having done it, because the thing was its own acknowledgement. Laurel's hand found Eli's arm. She did not squeeze it. She placed it there and left it, and they stood together on the limestone steps while the crowd dispersed around them, the specific kind of dispersal that follows the conclusion of a thing, people moving back to their cars and their phones and their next obligations, the moment already becoming the past for everyone except the people it most concerned. Birch made his way through the dispersing crowd toward them. He moved through people the way he moved through most things, without requiring the space around him to reorganize on his behalf, arriving in front of Laurel and Eli at the base of the steps, as though he had simply always been there. Laurel looked at him. Birch, she said, just his name with everything that needed to be in it, placed inside it, in the careful voice of a woman holding something almost too large to hold without losing the composure she had maintained through the entire preceding hour. Birch looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Eli. Let me sign the papers, he said. Then we'll talk. He went inside. Laurel and Eli stood on the steps in the cold and did not speak. The square was nearly empty. The morning had the quality of a morning after a decision has been made, the world materially unchanged and entirely different at the same time, the air the same temperature and the stone, the same limestone and the sky, the same flat gray, and yet none of it the same as it had been an hour ago, because the thing that had been uncertain was now settled, and settled things occupy a different kind of space than unsettled ones. Eli was not counting anything. He was thinking about the barn, about the feed bunk Harold had placed in 1963, about the morning light that came through the east window in the early hours and landed on the concrete floor of the feed aisle in a particular shape that shifted with the seasons, about the near pasture visible from the kitchen window, about the specific smell of the barn in winter, the warmth of it, the sound the cattle made when you came in and they heard you. He was thinking about all of it, not as a list of things, but as the single composite thing that a place becomes when you have been inside it long enough and paid enough attention to it that it is no longer separate from the way you understand yourself. He was thinking about what it meant that it was going to still be there tomorrow morning. He waited, without fidgeting, without projection, with his attention in the present moment, which was what 5 years of farm work had given him the capacity to do. Birch came back through the courthouse doors 20 minutes later, came down the steps and said, "Come on," and led them across the parking lot to his truck, a dark green 3/4 ton with high mileage and honest wear, the kind of vehicle that has been used correctly and maintained carefully and shows both of those things in its condition. They got in. Birch started the engine for the heat. He turned slightly in the driver's seat so he could see both of them, and he took his hat off and set it on the dashboard, and his hair was thin and gray, and his face had the specific weathered quality of a face that has spent 7 decades outside, and his eyes were the steady pale blue that Eli had been looking at across fence lines for 3 years. "Here is what I intend to do," Birch said. He said it without preamble, without throat clearing, without any of the framing that tells you how you are supposed to feel about what is coming. Just the words, with the expectation that they were sufficient. "I am going to hold the deed for 1 week. Then I am going to transfer it to Eli, his name alone held in trust until his 18th birthday. He paused. "There is one condition. 2 Saturday mornings a month on my fence lines until he turns 18. Laurel did not say anything for a moment. "Birch," she said, "that land is worth more than $21,000. "I know what it's worth," Birch said. Then It should belong to the person who loved it enough to save for it since he was 9 years old, Birch said. He said it the way he said everything, level and final, not unkind, not requiring a response, simply what was true. And there is nobody left who knows what Harold knew about that piece of ground who is in a position to pass it on. There are things about that land that take longer than 5 years to learn and longer than words to explain, and the right time to learn them is now, while the instincts are still forming. 2 Saturdays a month is how that gets done. Laurel looked at him. She looked out the windshield at the courthouse at the limestone steps where 40 minutes ago a man in a gray overcoat had told her son he did not belong there. The Saturdays, she said, that's all you want. The Saturdays, Birch said, and the work done the way it's supposed to be done. No corners, no shortcuts. The way a fence post is supposed to be set when you intend it to hold. I know how to set a fence post, Eli said. It was the first thing he had said since the gavel came down. Quiet and steady, with exactly as much emphasis as the words required, and no performance around them. Birch looked at him for a moment. Something in the older man's face shifted, something small enough that it barely registered as an expression, but that Eli recognized from 3 years of working alongside him, the particular movement that meant Birch had heard something he considered worth hearing. I know you do, Birch said. That's not the part I'm talking about. He looked back at Laurel. There are things Harold knew, he said, about when to push that land and when to rest it, about what it wants in a wet year and what it needs in a dry one, about the difference between farming a piece of ground and understanding it. Harold knew all of that. Doyle knows most of it. Eli has the right instincts. He needs the rest, and there isn't much time left in which to learn it, and there isn't anyone else left who can teach it. A pause. That's not charity. That's a practical problem with a practical solution. He picked his hat up from the dash and turned it slowly in his hands. It isn't charity, he said again more quietly. It's a continuation. The word landed in the cab of the old green truck in the parking lot of the Morrow County Courthouse, and it was the right word, the only word, and everyone in that cab felt the weight of it settle into its proper place. A continuation, not a rescue, not a gift. The thing that happens when something worth continuing finds the person willing to continue it, and the two of them are put in the same place at the right time by the accumulation of 100 smaller decisions that each seemed ordinary when they were made. Laurel's eyes were bright. She was not going to let them go further than bright, and she did not. All right, she said. All right, Birch said. He looked at Eli. 2 Saturdays a month, he said. I was going over there anyway, Eli said. Birch put his hat back on. I know, he said. That's why. He started driving. The fields on either side of the road, back through the county, were the same fields they had been that morning. Bare and brown, the ridges running, their long, familiar lines, the creek bottom still soft from the end of winter. They looked different through the passenger window of Birch Greer's truck than they had through the windshield of Laurel's car 3 hours earlier, and Eli could not have said precisely why, whether it was the truck or the direction they were facing or the quality of the light at this hour, except that he understood that it was not the fields that had changed. He had changed, and things look different from a changed position, even when the things themselves are exactly the same. He looked at the land. He looked at it the way you look at things you thought you might be losing and have been returned. They came up the lane of the Carney farm at noon. The house was visible at the end of the lane, the way it was always visible white against the winter fields, the covered porch, the kitchen window catching the flat light, the red bank barn behind it, the near pasture out to the creek, all of it sitting in the fold of the land between the ridges, in the morning fog that was long since gone now, in the still noon air exactly where it had always been. Doyle's truck was in the yard. He was standing on the porch. He had been there for a while. Eli could see it from the lane, not pacing, not moving, simply standing at the top of the porch steps with his hands in his coat pockets, the specific stillness of a man who has been waiting for something he cannot control and has exhausted all available alternatives to waiting. He watched them come up the lane. He watched the truck stop. He watched Laurel get out, and then Eli. He watched them walk toward the porch. His face was the face of a man who has used up most of what he had for the day before the day is half over. Laurel went up the porch steps. "It went to Birch," she said. Doyle looked at her. He looked at Birch's truck, idling at the bottom of the lane, at the profile of the old man visible through the windshield, the felt hat, the hands on the wheel, the face looking forward. Then he looked at his wife. She told him all of it. Standing on the porch in the cold noon air, without arrangement or ceremony, in the order things had happened, the passbook and the $9,400, the calls to the Sullivans and the Porters and Ruth Calloway, the $3,000 from the joint account, the envelope and the morning and the auction, and Laurel's raised hand at $17,200, and the crowd's reorientation, and Fenn's arithmetic, and the moment when everything they had had been said, and the numbers sat in the air and was not enough. And then the voice from the back of the crowd, and what Birch Greer had said in the cab of his truck in the parking lot, and what he intended to do with the deed and why. Doyle listened to all of it without interrupting. He listened with the complete and careful attention of a man who understands that what is being told to him is going to require everything he has in order to receive it properly. When Laurel finished, he was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that certain things require that cannot be shortened without losing something essential. Then he reached out and took her hand and held it. He held it and looked out past her over the near pasture that was visible from the porch, the same way it had been visible from the porch his whole life, and he did not speak, and the holding was enough. That evening after supper, the three of them sat at the kitchen table. Laurel told Eli what Birch had decided, all of it, the full shape of it, the deed transfer, the trust, until 18, the 2 Saturdays a month the word Birch had used at the end. Continuation. She told it carefully, giving each piece of it the space it needed, because this was the kind of telling that deserved care. Eli listened, the way he always listened, with his full attention on the words, without interrupting, without fidgeting, with the specific quality of attention that is itself a form of respect. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 2 Saturdays a month, he said, until I'm 18. Yes, Laurel said. Eli nodded slowly. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked up. I was going over there anyway, he said. Doyle looked at his son across the table. Eli, he said. Eli looked at his father. Did you know, Eli said. He said it quietly, without accusation, the way you ask something when you genuinely need to know the answer, rather than when you are trying to make a point. About the Saturdays, the account. Did you know? Doyle was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was still. The window showed the near pasture going dark in the early evening, the last of the light leaving the field in the way it always left, slowly from the far end. First the creek bottom going dark, before the upper pasture, the ridge holding the light longest. I saw you leave, Doyle said. Saturday mornings, before 6. I'd see you from the bedroom window going up the lane. He paused. I knew where you were going. I knew Birch was paying you for it. Another pause. I didn't know about the account. Why didn't you ask? Eli said. Doyle looked at his son for a long time. He looked at him the way you look at someone when you owe them the truth, and you are deciding whether you are going to give it or give something that resembles it, and you choose the truth because the person across from you has earned it. Because asking would have meant saying out loud that you had understood something I was trying to hide, Doyle said, that you had seen it before I was ready to let it be seen. He stopped. I was ashamed. He said it without flinching from the word, because the word was the right one. And I was proud at the same time. Of you, both of those things at once. He shook his head slightly. I didn't know how to carry both of them at the same time, so I didn't ask. I watched you go up the lane and I didn't ask. He looked at his hands on the table. I should have asked, he said. Eli looked at his father for a moment. He looked at the man across from him. The farming hands, the jaw that had been set against things for 5 years without breaking the face of a man who has just said the truest thing he knows how to say about himself. He reached across the table and placed his hand on his father's arm. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture did not already say, and saying something in addition would have been less, not more. He left his hand there, and he waited the way he had learned to wait steadily, without impatience, with the understanding that some things need the time they need. After a while, Doyle put his other hand over his face, not dramatically, not with sound, the quiet collapse of a man who has been holding something upright for a very long time, and has finally, in the presence of the two people who mattered most to him in the world, been allowed to put it down. His shoulders did not shake. He did not make a sound. He simply sat at the kitchen table with his hands over his face in the farmhouse Harold had built, with the window behind him, showing the near pasture, going fully dark now, the last light gone from the upper pasture too, and the kitchen lamp making a warm circle over all three of them. Eli kept his hand on his father's arm. After a while, Doyle lowered his hands. He looked at his son, the long look of a man who is seeing something clearly that he had not been able to see clearly before, not because it hadn't been there, but because he had not been able to look at it directly until now. Eli, he said, just the name, with everything in it, the 5 years and the passbook and the early mornings and the Saturday fence lines and the envelope and all the rest of it, all of it inside one word, the one word that was the right word because it was his son's name and his son had done all of it. I know, Dad, Eli said. They sat there for a while, the three of them at the table in the farmhouse. Harold Karn had built with the window looking out over the near pasture that was theirs again, or almost theirs, or his, or all of theirs together, in the way that the most important things are never quite anyone's alone, in the particular silence of people who have come through something together and do not need to discuss the coming through of it, because they are simply glad, in the deep and quiet way of people who have been genuinely afraid and have arrived on the safe side of it to be exactly where they are. In the morning, Eli went out and fed the cattle, the same barn, the same near pasture, the same farm, the same fold between the two ridges that caught the morning fog and held it and made the place feel on those mornings, especially like it existed slightly apart from the rest of the world. The deed transfer was completed the following Monday at the Morrow County Courthouse, recorded in the office of the Morrow County Recorder under the name Eli Ray Karn, the middle name given to him in honor of a great-grandfather named Raymond, which now appeared on a legal instrument describing 80 acres of southeastern Ohio hill country that Harold Karn had begun assembling in 1959 with a handshake and saved wages and the kind of patience that does not announce itself but simply continues, year after year, until it has built the thing it set out to build. Eli was 14 years old. He owned 80 acres. He owned them because he had been paying attention at 9 years old when no one had told him to pay attention, and no one would have blamed him for not noticing, because he had started working without being asked and kept working without being thanked through 5 years of early mornings and Saturday fence lines and July barn loft heat and summer mornings at a produce stand with a hand-painted sign and honest prices. Adding to a number he carried in a passbook, the way you carry something you cannot put down. And that number had turned out in the particular arithmetic of that March Friday to not be enough and to have been exactly enough at the same time. Birch Greer died 4 years later. He was 75 years old, and he had made his arrangements, which included an instruction to his son Garrett about continuing the Saturday sessions with Eli through his 18th birthday, an instruction Garrett honored, because Garrett Greer understood what his father had meant by it, and because he was the kind of man who honored his father's instructions even when they required something of him. Eli kept the Saturdays until the day he turned 18, as he had promised, because Eli Carney was not a person who kept promises conditionally. On his 18th birthday, the deed transferred to him free and clear. He is 22 years old now. He farms the 80-acre home parcel with the same Black Angus cattle his great-grandfather ran, selected for the same qualities Harold had valued: good genetics, quiet temperament, the kind of animal that rewards attention. He works nights at a logistics facility outside Mount Gilead to fund the operating costs the way Doyle worked nights at Harmon Industrial, because that is what hill country farmers do when the math requires it, and they are not too proud to do what the math requires. He is acquiring the additional parcels of the original Carney farm, one piece at a time, in the patient and unhurried way that Harold acquired land over 40 years, a little at a time, when the opportunity and the finances align, and not a moment before. He has not sold a single acre. He keeps the original passbook savings account open, the one from when he was 9 years old at the bank in Mount Gilead, the children's account with the paper passbook and the teller who smiled at the size of his deposits. He keeps it open because it was the first thing, and first things deserve to be kept present in your life rather than retired to memory. The deposits he makes into it now are for different purposes: land equipment, the slow accumulation of an operation that is becoming what Harold's operation became over 4 decades, something that can be passed on, but the account is the same account, and the passbook is the same passbook, and when he opens it, he sees his own handwriting from when he was 9 years old on the first deposit slip, the careful, uneven letters of a child who had not yet learned to be uncertain about what he was doing. Doyle Carn is still on the farm. His knees have begun to express their opinion about 40 years of farming in the way that farming knees eventually do, and he works alongside his son on the days when the work allows it. They do not talk much while they work because they are both people for whom work is a sufficient language, complete enough that additional words are mostly unnecessary. On a morning last October, they were walking the fence line along the south edge of the near pasture, checking the wire before the ground froze, moving through the inspection the way they moved through it every fall. Doyle stopped at a corner post near the creek end and ran his hand along the wire, the way you check tension when you are reading it rather than measuring it, not looking, feeling. He stood there for a moment. "This is one of Birch's," he said. Eli looked at the post. It was set deep and plumb, the wire running tight, and even off it, with no sag and no give, the kind of tension that holds through a decade of freeze-thaw cycles and 1,000 head of cattle leaning into it over the years. "I set that one," Eli said. 3 years ago." Doyle ran his hand along the wire once more. He nodded slowly, the small nod of a man who has received confirmation of something he already suspected. "Looks like one of Birch's," he said. He did not say anything more. He moved on down the fence line. Eli walked beside him in the October morning, the frost still on the grass, the light coming in low and golden, the way it does in that county in October, and the near pasture was visible behind them, and the creek was audible ahead of them, and the ridge ran its long, familiar line against the sky. It was the closest thing to a speech that Doyle Carn was capable of making about what his son had become. Eli understood it as such, and accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered, which is the only way such things can be accepted. Laurel went back to teaching at the county school substitute work that became more regular as the years went on. She has told this story, pieces of it, the parts that are hers, to exactly one person outside the family: Ruth Calloway, the retired schoolteacher who contributed $1,500 to a sealed envelope for a boy she had never met because she had once told a woman at a church potluck that she meant it when she said to call, and who, when the call came, found out that she did. Ruth cried when Laurel told her what the money had been part of. She said she was glad she had meant it. She said she had not been entirely sure at the time whether she meant it in the way that you mean things at the end of a pleasant evening, or in the way that you mean things when you are actually prepared to be tested on them. Now I know, she said, and that was all she said about it because it was enough. There is a version of this story that ends on the courthouse steps. It ends with the gavel and the $17,200 that was everything and was not enough, and Douglas Fenn walking away with the deed in his portfolio and the land becoming something other than what it had been for 60 years. That version is not unusual. It happens in hill counties and river counties and grain counties and every other county in this country where a farm goes to auction and the people who love it cannot outbid the people for whom it is only numbers. It happens more than it should and less than it might, and the families it happens to recalibrate their lives around the loss, and most of them find a way forward and the land goes on without them, which is the hardest part. This version has Birch Greer in it. It has Ruth Calloway and the Sullivans and the Porters. It has Laurel Carn making calls she did not find easy to make, and Doyle Carn sitting on a kitchen floor in the dark, and a farm kid standing on courthouse steps being told he does not belong there and not moving an inch. But above all of that, above everything else this story has in it, it has a boy who started saving at 9 years old because he was paying attention, not because anyone told him to, not because he had a plan or a guarantee or any certainty that the thing he was doing would matter when the moment came, because he looked at something his grandfather built and understood without words and without instruction that love without action is only feeling, and feeling alone does not keep a fence tight or a barn painted or a family on the land that is the ground beneath everything else they have and are and will pass on. He acted. For 5 years in the early mornings and on the Saturday fence lines and in the July heat of the barn lofts, he acted, and the acting accumulated the way things accumulate when they are done steadily and without stopping into something that mattered. The man in the gray overcoat told him he did not belong there. By Monday afternoon he was standing on his own land, and in that fold of the southeastern Ohio hill country, between two long ridges that catch the morning fog and hold it in the farmhouse Harold Carney built, in a time when a handshake was the real agreement, and the paper was just the record of it. A family sat at a kitchen table with the window looking out over the near pasture that was still theirs, and the farm was still there, and it still is,